Now, I was born in 1958, so I have memories of a Syria that predates the Ba'ath takeover of my country in 1963. And although I was young at the time the Ba'ath did come to power, I had already been very much part of a family that had been involved in politics, in elections, in the brief period, but very, very important and vital period that is particularly vital to us now as we try and recollect some ability and some energy to believe that we will have a future that will be democratic, that will be the bringing of governments to power by by elections. I still had some memory of that. And I remember the first time I sensed a deep unease and a deep fear within the sort of safe circle of my own family. When I said something, I remember asking my father if one of the people who had come to visit us was an Alawite. And my father's face turned chalk white, and he said to me in real distress and fear, he said, "You must never mention that word again." And this was because the Ba'ath takeover, and soon after it, the takeover, the so-called and ludicrously named corrective movement of Hafiz Assad, although it claimed to be a sort of secular, even atheist regime based on socialist principles with the glorious sort of epithet of wahda, hurriya, ishtirakiyya, which means unity, freedom, and socialism, none of which were, of course, honored. On the contrary, all of which were disdained and denatured as concepts and as moral choices by the regime that came to become one of the most sectarian and one of the most aggressive and corrupt in the Middle East. Now, I say this although I very much know the history of the Ba'ath in Iraq and of the kind of regime that Saddam Hussein created. Nevertheless, I really do not feel at this stage, and being well aware of the price that the Iraqi people have had to pay in their parallel history to ours, I very much feel that the Assads have been no better. Now, it wasn't easy to make a country like Syria diverse and iconoclastic and slightly crazy and fun-loving and free in the best sense of Mediterranean cultures, such as it was. It wasn't easy to turn it into the police state that we are witnessing the destruction of on our screens every evening. To do that, you had to make sure you could create a population that would be acquiescent in living under such a form of repression. Now, the first ideas that the Ba'ath brought could have been, and I say this even though I come from a family that suffered greatly from the decisions that were made economically in the country, they could have worked, and they could have worked very well. There were the nationalizations where all private property was nationalized, land was taken away from those who owned it and actually ran it, and ran it often quite well, to be distributed again, but so badly that it never ended up truly changing the status or the situation of farmers. The agricultural reforms that the Ba'ath, considered the basis of their rule were such that they ended up impoverishing the countryside to such an extent that Syria must be one of the most classic examples of a totally destroyed cultural class of farmers who then have to leave their land, become lumpen proletariat, if you like, and come to the slums in cities such as Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, and Hama. Apart from those things, there was the kind of beginning of the state taking on a role far larger than it should have, and we know this from the examples of the Soviet Union and the countries that lived behind the Iron Curtain and how that actually happened. It was, first of all, the destruction of that infrastructure that was a kind of spontaneous, incremental thing that had grown up over years of history in the souk, where there was always a sort of balance between consumers and merchants, between those who wanted to form unions and those who wanted those unions not to endanger their interests. So there was a kind of balance that most often did work, that was immediately hit by the Ba'ath, because all loyalty had to be not to your quarter or to your street or to your profession, as in these old cities like Damascus or the many cities in Morocco, for example, that many of you know, where the guilds had a huge role in running the city. So the street where my father's family came from, the Buzuriya, was the area that sold spices and all things to do with edible consumption that were traditionally made in the city. Then there was the larger and more difficult, because it was less a sort of economic or political decision that could be made, but the larger idea of destroying the sort of idea of individual freedom that countries that did have bourgeoisies were often able to sustain, even if they only sustained them in those elites that could afford to be could afford individualism. And so the idea that you could be individual in anything very quickly became a crime. And I remember this as an adolescent when I came into a classroom one day, and there was a military inspector who was a woman who came from who had come from one of the outlying villages near Homs. And she did the call of names, and when she came to my name, recognizing it as one that had, been very much part of Syrian democratic history, a greatly revered ancestor of mine, Fawzi Ghazi, had written the first constitution in Syria, and the most idealistic document that could be had in the Arab world. If we had it today, it would be beyond our wildest expectations. He had written that constitution, so he was called the father of the Syrian constitution, and because he refused to include an acceptance of the French mandate in it, the French assassinated him, dressing it up in true French savoir-faire as a crime passionnel. So having recognized my name, she knew that I kind of represented a history that the Ba'ath wanted to erase. And this was already in 1974, so 4 years after Hafiz Assad had come to power. I, in those days, had sort of curly short hair, and she called me up and she said to me, "You will go at once to the toilets, the toilets, and you will flush the toilet and make sure you drench your hair there." And this was a kind of attempt to, I tell you this as a personal story, but that is not the point of it. The point of it was an attempt to break the spirit of anyone who either retained some memory or whose family retained some memory of a different Syria. I was then, as I am now, highly eccentric and anarchist, so I, of course, rebelled against this bizarre request, and therefore was punished even more. And for 6 months of that terrible year, I was made an example of in ways that we know from the Cultural Revolution in China, from Russia, and that was how Hafiz Assad's Syria changed. The books we were taught were books that really were designed to make us forget our history, so anything that predated 1970 was blotted out. No one knew who the first president of the Republic had been. No one had any knowledge that there were elections that had brought governments to power. No one knew that there was a parliament that had been extremely lively and rambunctious and argumentative, where people of different opinions and people from different parties had thrashed out the wonderful, vibrant notion of a political life. That was sunk away. Now, this psychological warfare also became state intervention in the imagination, coming from a family that produced great poets and dramatists and artists. I saw that happening in the generation that was mine, where if you were an artist and if you were a poet and if you were a writer in Syria, you could only be published by the state publishing house. And to do that, you had to join the Writers' Union, which was a sort of offshoot of the Ba'ath Party. And you could then only write what the party accepted. And the censor ruled the lives of all artists. So if you painted something that wasn't considered, socialist realism, then it was questioned. And Syria, like Iraq, had an extraordinary tradition of both classical and of contemporary art. Some of the great world sculptors and painters were from Iraq and from Syria. And so they very quickly found themselves marginalized. And so it was the kind of intervention into the imagination that I, as a writer, found most sinister and eerie. And it continues to this day.